Now, tied in with this aversion to theory is a kind of waffling that goes on in certain crucial areas. Let's take religious discourse just as an example of this. We were mentioning this earlier. See, Wittgenstein himself obviously had a deep religious hunger. I mean, it wasn't this sort of a middle-class English attitude about religion that it's just something for Sunday mornings. No, he really had a religious hunger. There are these constant references to God and getting himself right with God, and yet I think most people would say that he was an atheist. Now, in a way, you feel almost that he wants to have it both ways, that he wants to be able to say things like, well, we just need to know the role that religious discourse plays in people's lives. But, of course, you won't understand that role unless you see that religious discourse refers beyond, that the only reason that people pray is because they think there's a God up there listening. And that's not, whether or not God is listening is not part of the language game. The language game of religion can only be played the way it is because people think there's something outside the language game that gives it sense. Okay, now that's for the bad part. Let me say what I think is really terrific in Wittgenstein. Well, first of all, I think most philosophers, what I'm going to say right now is kind of contemporary orthodoxy. Most philosophers would agree with this. He has made terrific contributions in the philosophy of language and in the philosophy of mind. His contribution in the philosophy of language is that he really mounted devastating attacks on the idea that words get their meaning by standing for things or by being associated with some introspective process, by standing for some mental thing in the mind. And he does knock those views pretty effectively. And also, he is pretty good, one, I think, of the most powerful, not the only one, but certainly one of the most powerful expressions of the view that speaking a language ought to be seen as a form of human activity, that words are also acts, words are deeds, and that is an important line of investigations. Now, in a way, his discussion in the philosophy of mind is just as important as his work in the philosophy of language, and it's a very effective attack on the Cartesian tradition, on the idea that we really live in two worlds, a mental world and a physical world. But his attack on Cartesianism is so powerful precisely because he doesn't make the mistake of most anti-Cartesians of thinking, yeah, you just have to reject the mind. Just say there isn't any such thing as mental phenomena. What he does is a painstaking analysis of a whole lot of psychological concepts, belief and fear and hope and expecting. And he goes through these, and what he shows you is that the deep grammar of these expressions is quite different from what you would think just looking at the surface, where we have nouns like mind and body, and where it looks like there are these two different things, minds and bodies. What he does is, by carefully describing these language games, he gets you to see that things like hope and fear and expectation and belief are grounded in situations, that we actually use these words in such a way where we're not inclined to think there must be some deep Cartesian divide. We say things like, he's been groaning and in pain for the past 2 hours, and we don't feel there, oh my gosh, he's mixed categories, the physical groaning and the mental pain. It's just a perfectly natural way of talking, and he shows us that our natural way of talking does not lead to any kind of Cartesianism. However, the most powerful part of Wittgenstein, from my own personal point of view, is not his work in the philosophy of language and mind, but it's an idea that really begins to acquire momentum in his last work. It also appears in his earlier work, but in his very last work that he wrote when he was dying, On Certainty. And it's a rather subtle idea, but it's this. We have, in the Western intellectual tradition, going back to Plato, we have the idea that any meaningful human behavior must somehow be the expression of a theory, an implicit theory that we hold. That if you understand me and I understand you, it can only because we each have a theory of the other.
Or, as you say, an implicit theory.
An implicit theory.
Yes,
Chomsky
yes,
thinks this, that there's
yes,
an unconscious
yes,
theory of language.
yes.
And artificial intelligence is based on this presupposition, that there are these unconscious theories. Now, there's some truth in that, but Wittgenstein is anxious to emphasize that a great deal of what we do is both socially and biologically primitive. It's a way of responding. It's a way of acting. We just act. We don't need to appeal to the idea that there's some implicit theoretical structure that enables us to act. And as usual, he gives very good similes. He says, look, think of squirrels storing nuts for the winter Now, do they do that because they think Hume's problem of induction has been solved and we now know that the future resembles the past? No, they just do it. Now he says, think of yourself and putting your hand in the fire. Is the reason you don't put your hand in the fire, is it because you think you've refuted Hume? Or you think you've got very good inductive evidence? No, you just don't do it. You couldn't be dragged into that fire. And he says a great deal of our human activity has to be seen like that. We're just responding in ways that are both biologically and culturally conditioned. But his ground floor statement, he keeps repeating this, is we just act. That's the way we do it. And this goes against the whole tradition where we try to think, well, we can only do what we do because we've got an implicit theory.
Do you think there's still a lot of juice in this, or do you think that Wittgenstein himself has made all of the really importantly creative and constructive use of these ideas that can be made?
Oh, no, I think there's a great deal more to be said on this. Secondly, he didn't do all the work. He just got started.
Thank you very much, Professor Searle. Excellent, John. I thought that was